Pre-Islamic Arabia. The dry, mountainous landscape of the Hijaz is not an environment that gives much life. Situated in the western part of the Arabian Peninsula, this land can be described with two words, dry and hot. In the summer, temperatures regularly rise to well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with little precipitation. Further east, endless sand dunes mark a landscape devoid of greenery or permanent settlements. Yet it was from this harsh landscape that, in the early 600s, a new movement emerged, one that would change the course of history in the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. Geography. The Arabian Peninsula covers an area of over 2 million square kilometers in the southwestern corner of Asia. Situated between Asia, Africa, and Europe, the land is unique in its connection with all three continents of the Old World. Despite its position, it has been mostly ignored by outsiders. The ancient Egyptians chose to expand into the Fertile Crescent and Nubia rather than venture into Arabia's deserts. Alexander the Great passed by it in the 300s BCE on his way to Persia and India. The great Roman Empire attempted to invade the peninsula through Yemen in the 20s BCE, but could not adapt to the harsh landscape and thus failed to annex the region. One could hardly blame outsiders for ignoring the Arabian Peninsula. Its dry climate is barely hospitable, even for the nomads who live there. Monsoon winds bring seasonal rains to the southern coast of the peninsula in the autumn, but these are stifled by the quickly rising landscape and never make it deep into Arabia's deserts. Similarly, rains from the Mediterranean Sea barely touch upon the northern extremities of the Arabian desert. The result is that the vast majority of the peninsula remains dry year-round. Parched riverbeds known as wadis run throughout the land, yet they are barely recognizable as rivers. When clouds gather and rains fall, they become gushing and powerful waterways, essential for the growth of the seasonal flora that manages to bloom in this dry land. Once the wet season is over, however, the wadis return to their usual, dry state, useless as sources of water. More reliable are the oases, small fertile spots surrounded by the vast expanse of the desert. They were capable of serving host to small communities, or as waypoints for travelers, but were hardly enough to sustain an advanced and large society. The Arabs' civilizations tend to be greatly shaped by the environments in which they develop, and the Arabs are no exception. Everything about the life of the Arab was based around the harsh environment in which he lived. Due to the desert's inability to support settled civilization, the Arabs were constantly on the move in search of fertile land for their flocks. One theory of the etymology of the label Arab even posits that the word itself comes from a Semitic root meaning wandering or nomadic. The Arabs would spend the summer months around whatever oases or wells they could rely on year after year, trying to make supplies and water last by living on the bare minimum. After months of enduring the summer heat, they would migrate to the south, near Yemen, where rain fell in the autumn and fertile land appeared for their herds. The rain-fed pastures gave their flocks of sheep, goats and camels enough food to live off through the winter months as they pitched their tents and temporarily settled. By the time the rain stopped and the dry season began again in the spring, the Arabs returned to their oases and wells to wait out another summer. This harsh cycle had been the norm for the nomadic Arabs since time immemorial, and it remains in place for the Bedouin Arabs who still live in Arabia's deserts. In pre-Islamic Arabia, hospitality was of such importance that a guest at the home of an Arab was guaranteed at least 3 days of total security and protection before he would even be questioned about why he was there. This tradition was further reinforced by the Prophet, who stated that a guest has the right to be hosted for 3 days. The desert was not a place to be alone. With so many threats to the survival of the Arabs, community cooperation was essential. Reliance on relatives was the first line of defense against famine and the heat that constantly threatened survival. Families were expected to share resources and shelter, and the concept of pure individualism was strongly frowned upon. As such, the family, and by extension, the tribe, served as the most important unit within Arab society. Groups of families traveled together and were considered a Qabila, or clan. Several clans would constitute a tribe, led by a tribal leader called a sheikh. Tribal identity and belonging were vital in the pre-Islamic world. Belonging to a tribe brought protection, support, and economic opportunities. Tribes would go to battle to defend one of their own, and tribal warfare was unerringly common. Before the arrival of Islam, competition over grazing lands and flocks regularly brought tribes into devastating wars which could last years and extract a heavy human toll on the participants. For the Arabs, struggle was a constant, against both man and nature. In a tribal, nomadic society like this, artistic expression becomes difficult. The resources and time necessary to complete great sculptures and paintings like the ancient civilizations of Egypt and Greece were almost non-existent. Yet the natural human desire to search for beauty could not be extinguished by the desert sands. Instead it took on a new form, language. Perhaps more than any other language in the world, Arabic itself is a form of artistic expression. Word and sentence structure is fluid, creating many different ways for a person to express the same idea. Poetry thus naturally became the de facto art of Arabia. Long, epic poems glorifying tribes and heroism in war were their greatest works of art. The finest poets were revered celebrities in every way. Their words were memorized by the masses and repeated for generations. The 7 most magnificent pre-Islamic poems were known as the Mu'allaqat, meaning the hanging ones. They were so called because they were hung on the walls of the Kaaba in Mecca, or alternatively because they were hung in the hearts of all Arabs, due to their reverence for the poetic medium. Despite being an advanced literary society, writing was rare in the Arabian Peninsula. While a written form of the language did exist by the 500s, it was rarely learned. Memorization was enough. For the Arabs, who were capable of learning poems that were thousands of lines long by heart so they could repeat them to future generations. Memorization would prove to be a vital skill once Islam arrived in the peninsula in the 600s. When it came to religion, the pre-Islamic Arabs were almost exclusively polytheistic. Islamic tradition holds that the Prophet Abraham, and his son, Ismail, built the Kaaba in the valley of Mecca in ancient times as a house of worship for one God. The Kaaba was built as a plain rectangular building on a foundation set by the first man Adam. From this shrine, Ismail was able to preach the monotheistic message to the Arabs, who adopted him as one of their own. Over the centuries, however, the progeny of Ismail distorted his monotheistic teachings. Stone and wood idols were carved to represent attributes of God. Later, they would go on to represent separate gods entirely. By the time of the Prophet Muhammad, there were 360 gods in the Kaaba. The message of Ibrahim and Ismail was not entirely lost on the Arabs, however. The 2 prophets were still revered figures in the minds of the Arabs, and even some of their basic teachings still held weight in this society. They certainly believed in the God of Ibrahim and Ismail, called Allah in Arabic. But they believed he was one among many different gods, represented by the idols. This belief system was far removed from the strict monotheism those two prophets had preached, and reflected influence from Sumerian religions to the north. Isolated Christian and Jewish communities existed within the Arabian Peninsula and also revered the prophets, but that was where their similarities ended. The sparse monotheists of Arabia tended to avoid complete assimilation with the polytheistic Arabs, instead creating their own insular communities. Arabia's neighbors. In spite of being deep in the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, far from more advanced civilizations, the Arabs were not completely isolated from their neighbors. The Romans had become a regional superpower along the northern borders of the peninsula in the early decades CE. By putting down numerous Jewish revolts in the province of Syria-Palestina, the Romans stamped their control on the area. For the Bedouin Arabs, this meant the presence of a wealthy and strong trading partner to the north. Merchants regularly traversed the western part of the peninsula from Yemen in the south to Syria in the north, trading goods that came from places as far away as India and Italy. The Romans were content to remain in the more hospitable and familiar lands of the Fertile Crescent and let the nomadic Arabs carry on the trade with more distant lands. To the northeast of Arabia lies the Iranian plateau. The rise of the Sassanid dynasty in Persia in the 200 CE ushered in a centuries-long struggle between the Romans and Persians, which would have its effects on the Arabs. The border between the two great empires fluctuated, but was generally in the Syrian desert. In the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula, both the Romans and the Persians attempted to gain the upper hand by using Arab tribes, usually ones that had converted to Christianity, as proxies. Keen to use this conflict to their own benefit, two Arab tribal confederations developed into client states for the great powers. The Ghassanids founded a kingdom in what are now the modern countries of Jordan, Syria, and Palestine, where they served as a buffer for the Roman Empire. Similarly, the Lakhmids controlled southern Mesopotamia and served the Persians. Both Arab kingdoms were greatly influenced by their overlords, who spent heavily on keeping their vassals well equipped in the face of the enemy. Yet the constant warfare between the two sides would slowly wear down all four parties. By the early 600s, the Romans and Persians were exhausted by decades of warfare and were weakening behind a facade of militaristic power. The Ghassanids and Lakhmids too felt the stress of war, as they were mere pawns in this constant conflict. Most Arab tribes, however, avoided the external conflict between the two imperial powers. They were more interested in carrying on a profitable trade with the two warring empires than helping to decide the winner. To the south of the peninsula was the powerful kingdom of Aksum in Abyssinia, modern Ethiopia. Based high in the Abyssinian mountains, Aksum was a powerful trading state that connected inland African kingdoms, the Indian Ocean Sea routes and the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. As a crossroad for trade, it had considerable influence on Arab merchants, who dealt with the Aksumites in Yemen. Like Rome, Aksum was a Christian empire that had tension with Persia on numerous occasions. Control of trade routes running through Yemen was a constant source of friction, as both sides sought to turn local leaders into vassals. In the increasingly globalized world of the early 600s, the Arabs were aware of their neighbors and became affected by events outside the Arabian Peninsula. Being at a crossroads of three powerful states meant being aware of international politics and having the skill to use rivalries to their advantage. Yet, despite their precarious location, the Arabs were safe in the depths of the desert. They called their peninsula Jazirat al-Arab, meaning the island of the Arabs due to how isolated its inhabitants were. This isolation proved to be greatly beneficial. The harsh environment meant that none of the surrounding states could invade and occupy Arab lands. The Arabs' traditional cycle of wandering and their way of life was mostly unaffected by regional politics and wars. In this protected environment, a movement would rise in the early 600s that would have huge implications for the surrounding states, and eventually the entire world. It would change the destiny of the Arabs forever, building on and using their unique abilities and doing away with the negative cultural traits that kept them as wandering, warring nomads. Geography, climate, culture and politics together all led to the perfect environment in which Islam could rise to become a world power faster than any other movement, religion, or empire in world history. It would sweep out of the deserts of Arabia into the battered Roman and Persian empires, conquering territories and assimilating diverse peoples, creating an empire that stretched from Spain to India by the early 700s. The world's largest at the time. This exponential growth in power and civilization would have been unfathomable to the Arabs of the early 600s, who were struggling to survive. Yet all it took was the arrival of a man who came with a revolutionary message and a promise to the Arabs of a new destiny, one beyond the sands of Arabia, Muhammad. 2. The life of the Prophet. The Prophet Muhammad was born in the town of Mecca around the year 570 CE. He belonged to the Banu Hashim clan, a subset of the Quraysh tribe that controlled Mecca, the trading and religious center deep in the heart of the Arabian Peninsula. About 80 kilometers inland from the Red Sea, it benefited greatly from the north-south trade routes that connected the Romans in the north and Yemen in the south. Yet, Mecca was far detached from both these places. Hundreds of kilometers of desert surrounding the valley town allowed it to develop independent of any foreign control or influence. Mecca was at once both internationally connected and isolated. But when it came to religion, Mecca was a focal point for the entire Arabian Peninsula. It was the location of the Kaaba and the annual pilgrimage that attracted Arabs from all over the peninsula. So while Mecca was far away enough to elude imperial control by the Byzantines or Persians, it was central enough to have a major impact on the Arab people. Both of these characteristics would play a major role when Islam began to spread. Early life. Muhammad's early life was marked by hardship and loss. His father, Abdullah, died before his birth while on a trading mission in the town of Yathrib, north of Mecca. His mother, Aminah, died when he was 6, leaving his respected grandfather, Abd al-Muttalib, to care for him. 2 years later, his grandfather also died and Muhammad came to live with his paternal uncle, Abu Talib. Despite belonging to the wealthy tribe of Quraysh, Muhammad did not grow up amid riches. His status as an orphan and his belonging to the clan of Banu Hashim, considered an inferior branch of Quraysh, meant he was not a part of the ruling class. He did, however, accompany his uncle on numerous trading missions to Syria in his childhood, inaugurating him into the age-old nomadic tradition of the Arabs. His reputation as an honest trader led to him being known by 2 nicknames, as Siddiq and Al-Amin, meaning the truthful and the trustworthy. He was thus respected by the Quraysh, and he was regularly trusted with money and business transactions, acting as an arbiter in many cases. By his 20s, Muhammad was an accomplished merchant, working as an agent for a wealthy widow named Khadija. Eventually, his reputation as an honest and reliable man caught the attention of his employer, and when he was 25, Khadija proposed to Muhammad, who accepted, despite being several years her junior. Although being surrounded by a polytheistic idol-worshipping society, the Young Muhammad did not get involved in the religion of the Quraysh. The original monotheistic message of Ibrahim and Ismail was a faint memory to most Arabs. But it still held weight for a few, known as the Hunafa, singular Hanif, meaning monotheists, who refused to accept the hundreds of stone and wood gods. Muhammad was one of them. Instead of engaging in the idol worship so rampant in society, Muhammad chose seclusion. He made a habit of retreating to a cave atop a mountain about 5 kilometers from the center of Mecca, where he would sit in silence and reflect on the society and religion that surrounded him in Mecca. The first revelations. According to Islamic tradition, in 610, while sitting in the cave he had come to many times before, Muhammad experienced something new. An angel suddenly appeared to him in the cave, commanding him, "Read." He responded that he did not know how. Like most people in Mecca, Muhammad was illiterate. Again, the angel demanded he read. Again, Muhammad responded that he was unable to. A third time, the angel demanded he read, and for a third time, Muhammad responded that he was unable to. The angel then recited to him the first verses of the Quran to be revealed. Recite in the name of thy Lord who created. He created man from a clot of blood. Recite, and thy Lord is the most bountiful. He who hath taught by the pen taught man what he knew not. Quran 96. He repeated the words after the angel, who then informed him that he is Gabriel, an angel sent by the one God, and that Muhammad is the messenger of God. Shaken and scared, Muhammad rushed home, not knowing what to make of the encounter. He was comforted by Khadija, who believed his account of the encounter in the cave. She asked her cousin, who was familiar with Jewish and Christian scriptures, what this could mean. When he heard of what happened, he immediately accepted Muhammad as the messenger of his time, like Moses and Jesus before him. Consoled by his wife and her cousin, Muhammad accepted his mission as the messenger of God, and his life as the prophet began. The first person to hear of Muhammad's prophethood and accept it was Khadija, who can be said to have converted immediately upon his return from the cave. He soon began to invite those closest to him to this new religion. His closest companion, Abu Bakr, his young cousin, Ali, and his house servant, Zayd. All respected and trusted Muhammad, and thus immediately accepted him as a prophet. They began to inform those closest to them, and slowly the number of people who accepted Muhammad began to grow. The first attempts at proselytizing were covered. Mecca was, after all, a polytheistic society, and the idea of one God replacing the numerous idols in the Kaaba would no doubt be seen as a threat. Thus, the early months and years of Islam were marked by the development of a secret, hidden group, fearful of society's reaction to them, but submitting to the ideas of this new religion. They were called Muslims, meaning submitters. The word Islam itself, from which Muslim derives, denotes submission to God and His will. Woe to every scorner and mocker who collects wealth and continuously counts it. He thinks his wealth will make him immortal. No. He will surely be thrown into the fire. Quran 104:1, 4. At the same time, the core ideas of Islam began to take shape through continuing revelations, which would be shared throughout the community. Strict monotheism, far different from the prevailing religion of Mecca, was the core theme. According to Muhammad, there was only one God. The idols worshipped by the Meccans were nothing more than useless statues of stone and wood, and were incapable of bringing benefit to anyone. The verses also warned of a day of reckoning, when all souls would be brought before God to account for their deeds. Those who believed in God and did good deeds would enter an eternal heaven as a reward. Those who did not would have a place in hell and would be eternally tormented. But Islam was not just concerned with theology and life after death. The early verses also denounced social ills that were prevalent in Mecca. With increasing prosperity from the trade routes, distinct social classes developed. The wealthy would use their money to fund more caravans that would in turn bring them more wealth. A poor person, meanwhile, continued to be marginalized, doubly so if they did not belong to a powerful clan. The Quran declared such disregard for the poor as detrimental to the establishment of a just social order, and worthy of punishment in the hereafter. It would be years until the rules regarding society would be laid down, but from early on, it was clear that Muhammad had come not just to change people's religious beliefs, but also society itself. The early revelations repeated these themes numerous times. The verses and chapters revealed in Mecca, which are found towards the end of the Quran, tended to be short and to the point. This worked well for the nascent Muslim community, which was still unknown to the rest of the city. When around fellow believers, the Muslims would discuss the latest revelations among themselves and teach each other. When around non-Muslims, they had to hide their conversion and beliefs. After all, these new ideas would threaten the established social order of Mecca. Social, economic, and tribal equality flew directly in the face of the wealthy and powerful members of Quraysh. Social revolution is rarely welcomed by those in positions of power. Even if Muhammad had not advocated any change in society, the new beliefs alone were a threat to the economic and social position of the polytheists. Because of the Kaaba, Mecca was a religious center for Arabs throughout the Arabian Peninsula. Once a year, Arabs would travel to Mecca for a pilgrimage and to honor the hundreds of idols kept around the Kaaba. This meant big business for the Quraysh. Trade was a natural byproduct of the pilgrimage, with people from so many distant lands in the same place at the same time. A natural market evolved which made Mecca a religious, economic, and political focal point of Arabia. And as the facilitators of this trade, the Quraysh stood to make huge profits. Muhammad's message, however, denied the importance of the idols, emphasizing the unity of God. Without idols, there would be no pilgrimage. With no pilgrimage, there would be no business. This was not a scenario that was pleasing to the Quraysh, and the early followers of Muhammad knew that. For this reason, there could be no mention of this new religion around the leaders of the tribe. The Muslim community was still small and weak enough that it could not yet come into open ideological conflict with those in positions of power, especially considering the fact that most of the early converts were those who were considered the lowest class of society. Slaves, servants, and the poor made up a large proportion of the early Muslim community, attracted by the equality of all people before God and the egalitarian nature of the new religion, where wealth and social status did not determine a person's worth. Persecution. Eventually the size of the Muslim community became too large for the rest of Quraysh to ignore. Previously the Muslims had been able to perform their prayers together in a secluded area on the outskirts of the town. But as their prayer groups grew larger, the chances of them being seen increased. That is exactly what happened as a group of praying Muslims were seen by a group of idol worshippers, whose immediate reaction was to ridicule the Muslims and their prayer. At first the Quraysh were content to view the small community as an abnormality to be mocked, until they realized the gravity of these new ideas. Monotheism, social justice, equality, and submission to the rule of God were all threatening theories to the Quraysh. In the eyes of many leading members of Quraysh, the solution was to rid themselves of this new religious and social movement by getting rid of the source, Muhammad. But Arab society still had structure and rules. Although Muhammad was an orphan, he was still under the protection of his uncle, Abu Talib, who was the leader of the Banu Hashim clan of Quraysh. Abu Talib himself refused to accept Islam, but his dignity and respect for Arab social customs demanded that he protect his nephew. Furthermore, age-old Arab customs dictated that if Muhammad was killed, his clan would have permission to go after his killers, and thus civil war could break out on the streets of Mecca. So Muhammad himself could not be harmed, but the protection that he enjoyed was not extended to his followers, many of whom were not protected by any clan or family. The Quraysh decided to threaten and persecute them, in the hopes of discouraging others from joining the new religion. Muslims were thus regularly harassed and deprived of the same rights as polytheists in Mecca. While Muhammad himself had protection, he was powerless to stop the oppression of his followers. Quraysh also took steps to prevent the spread of the new religion outside of Mecca. A group of Muslim refugees who escaped to Abyssinia were promised protection by its Christian king, the Negus. The Quraysh sent emissaries after them, hoping to convince the king to give up his protection and send the Muslims back to Mecca to be persecuted. When the Negus heard Muhammad's cousin Ja'far recite verses from the Quran about Islamic beliefs regarding Jesus and Mary, he refused to forsake his fellow monotheists, and the Quraysh had to go back to Mecca without the refugee Muslims. But even if Muslims had not escaped to distant lands, Islam could still spread beyond Mecca. Thousands of Arabs visited the city each year, and if some of those visitors heard Muhammad's message and saw Quraysh's inability to stop his unorthodox ideas, the status of Quraysh as one of the leading tribes in the peninsula would begin to wane. Alternatively, the visitors would believe Muhammad, accept his religion, and take it back to their homelands, spreading Islam outside of Mecca, and making it harder to stop. All of this led to the extreme measures taken by the Quraysh. In 617, approximately 7 years after the first revelations, the Quraysh decided to implement an all-out boycott on Muhammad's clan, Banu Hashim, to whom many Muslims belonged. No one was to enter into any business transactions with them, nor marry anyone to a member of the clan. They were even forced into exile in a barren valley just outside of Mecca. This had disastrous humanitarian effects on the Muslim community. Persecution brought hunger, social isolation and economic woes to the Muslims, and even the non-Muslims who happened to be part of Banu Hashim, such as Abu Talib. The few Muslims not belonging to Banu Hashim, such as Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, did all they could to supply the persecuted group by circumventing the boycott's rules, although at great personal loss. The boycott was draining on the entire Muslim community, those belonging to Banu Hashim as well as other clans. In the end, the boycott was ineffective in persuading Muhammad to discontinue his preaching, and it was thus ended after just over a year of enforcement. Despite Quraysh's efforts, more people continued to accept Islam. The boycott also revealed the strength of ties in the young community, as those not a part of Banu Hashim were still willing to sacrifice their wealth and safety to help their brothers and sisters that were being persecuted. Here, one of the core concepts of Islam, that loyalty to the religion transcended loyalty to a tribe or family, was on full display. The boycott was not without its effects, however. Years of being denied food and access to shelter, coupled with physical abuse, took a toll on the Muslims. The persecution probably played a role in the death of the Prophet's wife, Khadija, in 619. She had been the first convert and had stood by Muhammad through the adversity he had faced at the hands of Quraysh. The emotional support she provided in the early years was indispensable for the Prophet, encouraging him to continue in the face of persecution. The loss was a huge one on Muhammad, but it was not the only loss he had to deal with. Soon afterwards, his uncle who had protected him, Abu Talib, became ill and died. Although he did not accept Islam, he endured persecution like the rest of Banu Hashim and never gave up protection of his nephew. Beyond being another emotional loss for Muhammad, the death of Abu Talib had huge implications for the Muslim community. Without a strong leader, there was little to protect Muhammad and the rest of the Muslim community from the leaders of Quraysh, who were becoming bolder in their attacks on the Muslims, verbally as well as physically. Despite his love for the city of Mecca, Muhammad decided to try to find another city that would accept him and give him more freedom to preach his religion than the Quraysh did. The natural choice was Taif, a town ruled by the tribe of Thaqif, 65 kilometers to the southeast of Mecca. He rode out to Taif and met with the three brothers who led the tribe. They unequivocally rejected his proposal that they accept Islam and refused to grant him any form of protection. To make matters worse, on his way out of the city and back to Mecca, a crowd of people from Taif gathered to pelt him with stones and insults, leaving him bloodied by the time he was safely out of range of the city. Islamic tradition holds that he was visited by the angel Jibreel, who asked the Prophet if he would like him to destroy the city of Taif between two mountains as punishment for their treatment of the messenger of God. The Prophet replied in the negative, stating that he hopes perhaps one of their descendants would one day be a believer. This event would play a huge role in the spiritual connection between Indian Muslims and the Prophet in later centuries. After losing his family's support, being rejected by neighboring tribes, and watching his own followers persecuted for their faith, Muhammad recognized that a radical change was necessary if Islam was to survive at all. The opportunity for such a change came from an oasis town 300 kilometers north of Mecca, Yathrib. The two main tribes of Yathrib, Aws and Hazraj, were engaged in a perpetual struggle for power that turned deadly in the 610s. Further exasperating the problem, numerous Jewish tribes also lived in Yathrib and had trouble coexisting with the local Arabs. Muhammad's reputation as a trustworthy and reliable man was already well known in Yathrib, and it was in 620 when numerous notables from the town traveled to Mecca to seek his emigration to Yathrib to serve as their leader and a mediator of their disputes. Muhammad accepted their offer and encouraged his followers in Mecca to make the journey with him, where the oppression of the Quraysh was absent. Muhammad himself was one of the last to leave Mecca in 622, when he journeyed with his close friend Abu Bakr, barely eluding Quraysh's plans to have him murdered before he could leave. In Yathrib, which was soon renamed Al-Medina al-Munawwara, the Radiant City, officially known as Medina, the city, Muhammad would find security, and the ability to spread Islam away from Quraysh's opposition. Medina. The Prophet's flight from Mecca was known as the Hijra, meaning the emigration. It marked a turning point in early Islamic history and is used to this day as the beginning of the Islamic calendar. No longer was the Muslim community a marginalized group and Muhammad a social outcast. The Muslim community would now turn Medina into the first Muslim state, and Muhammad into its leader. The example set by the Prophet in his 10 years in Medina would inspire hundreds of years of Muslim politics, social order, and economics. But life in Medina was certainly not without challenges. Chief among them was the new mix of emigrants from Mecca, known as the Muhajirun, and the original residents of Medina, the Ansar. The Muhajirun were not a single cohesive unit. None of the clans of Mecca converted entirely, so the community of emigrants represented a diverse group of people, on their own without the protection of a clan or tribe. In contrast, the Ansar belonged to either Aws or Hazraj, the two embattled tribes of the Oasis. Furthermore, there were numerous individuals who belonged to neither group, immigrants from lands as far away as Africa, Persia, and the Byzantine Empire. For many Muslims, where their loyalties should lie was a major question. In response, the Prophet made clear that the old pre-Islamic ideas of loyalty were outdated. Instead, they were superseded by loyalty to the Ummah, the Muslim nation. In the eyes of Muhammad, it did not matter if a Muslim hailed from Quraysh, Aws, Hazraj, or even the Jewish tribes. Once they accepted Islam, they were part of a new community of brotherhood based on shared belief, not shared ancestry. The Jews are one community with the believers. To the Jews their religion and to the Muslims their religion. This applies to their clients and to themselves with the exception of anyone who has done wrong or committed treachery, for he harms only himself and his family. The Constitution of Medina. Muhammad's new political and social order in Medina came to be codified in a text known as the Constitution of Medina. The Constitution detailed that, under Muhammad's authority, Medina would operate as a state based on Islamic law. The Ummah was to operate as one political unit. Furthermore, Muhammad would act as the city's ultimate arbitrator. Old Arab customs regarding revenge and honor in the face of injustice were eliminated in favor of a structured justice system based on Islamic law. The Constitution gave the Oasis's Jews freedom to practice their religion, but they had to recognize the political authority of Muhammad over the city and join the common defense in the case of an attack from Quraysh. Muhammad's nascent political entity in Medina would serve as the model Islamic state for centuries of Muslim governments, particularly with regards to the treatment of non-Muslim minorities. The nature of the continuing revelations changed to match the change in circumstances for the Muslim community. Verses and chapters revealed to Muhammad in Medina tended to be longer than the ones from Mecca, detailing things such as forms of worship, taxation, inheritance, and relations between Muslims and non-Muslims. The Quran provided the generalities of how a Muslim society should operate, and where necessary, Muhammad explained the precise details. His words and actions, known as the hadith, were a vital source of guidance and law, second only to God's revelation itself. But the Quran was not only concerned with law and social order. Many of the Medinese verses described the stories of earlier prophets. Stories of Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, and Jesus were all described in great detail to Muhammad's followers, making very clear that Muhammad was simply the last in a long line of prophets, and that his message is no different from theirs. Much of this was aimed at the Jewish community of Medina. On the surface, they shared much in common with the Muslims. They were both monotheistic in a land known for polytheism, they both revered the same prophets, and early on in Muhammad's prophethood, they both prayed towards Jerusalem. As a result, some of Medina's Jews accepted Muhammad as a prophet and converted to Islam. Jewish scriptures speak of a Messiah, and to them, Muhammad was that promised man. But many more rejected Muhammad. Judaism is unique, in that belief and ethnicity were tied to the concept of a chosen people. Muhammad's message of egalitarianism and the unity of all Muslims regardless of ethnicity challenged some of the main ideas the Jews believed in. Some probably genuinely believed he was a prophet, but the fact that he was not a Hebrew was problematic for those who followed Jewish theology strictly. The divide between a Jewish community that believed themselves to be specially chosen by God and a Muslim community that advocated the unity of all people would develop into serious tensions between the two faith groups. The battles. The Prophet's hijrah to Medina did not mean the end of conflict with the Quraysh. The Muhajirun were still bitter at their treatment by their fellow clansmen in Mecca, and the Ansar were eager to punish those who had oppressed their new brothers in Islam. But the Muslim community had not yet been given permission to fight by the Prophet. Warfare is, of course, a serious endeavor, especially in the Arabian Peninsula, where complex rules regarding honor and vengeance had reigned for centuries. Furthermore, the Quran itself testifies to the sanctity of life and the egregiousness of unjustly taking one. The Muslim community was thus hesitant to act militarily against Mecca, despite the years of oppression they faced at the hands of the Meccans. But that changed early on in Muhammad's time in Medina. He proclaimed to his followers a new revelation from God, which stated permission to fight has been given to those who are being fought, because they are wronged. And indeed, God is competent to give them victory. They are those who have been evicted from their homes without right only because they say, "Our Lord is Allah." Quran 22:39, 40. These new verses made clear to Muhammad's followers that war was permissible, even obligatory, when Muslims were being oppressed. They also signaled an important aspect of Islam's role in the world, that this religion was not just a set of beliefs about the unseen, but a complete way of life that encompassed everything from prayer rituals to foreign relations to theology. Like they did with other instructions given in the Quran, the Muslim community of Medina was eager to show their worth and follow this new command. The opportunity came in 624 when the Muslim community mustered a small army of around 300 men to intercept a caravan belonging to Quraysh that was passing by Medina. The Muslims were unable to reach the caravan, but ended up meeting a much larger Qurayshi force that had been sent to protect the caravan. At the Battle of Badr, about 100 kilometers southwest of Medina, the Muslims had their first opportunity to physically fight their former oppressors. Despite being outnumbered, the Muslim army, commanded by the Prophet's uncle Hamza, managed to rout the Meccans, taking numerous prisoners. The Battle of Badr was of monumental importance for the new community at Medina. It established the Muslims as a real political and military force, while simultaneously lowering the prestige of Quraysh in the eyes of the rest of the Arabs. The Quraysh were of course not willing to allow such a humiliating defeat to go unpunished. The next year an even larger Meccan army was assembled, with the aim of harassing Medina enough to lower Muhammad's newfound prestige and call into question his ability to protect his followers. The army camped out a few kilometers north of the city, in the shadow of the imposing Mount Uhud, where they could harass the rural farms surrounding Medina. As part of the constitution of Medina, Muhammad had vowed to protect the city and its inhabitants, and was thus compelled to organize a fighting force to go out and confront the Meccans. There was, however, a group within the city that opposed his plan, believing that their best bet was to leave the rural farmers to fend for themselves and keep the army inside the city to defend it. They were joined by two of the Jewish tribes of the city, who refused to go out to Uhud to battle a superior force. Muhammad was thus forced to march out to Uhud with a considerably smaller army than he anticipated. The results of the battle were disastrous for the Muslims. The Meccans, led by the brilliant Khalid ibn al-Walid, who would later convert to Islam and lead Muslim armies into Syria, managed to rout the Muslims from the battlefield up onto the slopes of Uhud. Hamza, the hero of Badr, was killed in the fighting and his body mutilated by the Quraysh. Muhammad himself was at one point surrounded along with a small group of Muslims by the Meccans and was injured in the hand-to-hand combat that followed. The Quraysh, having defeated the Muslim army in battle and believing they had done enough to damage Muhammad's reputation, retreated back to Mecca. The Battle of Uhud did not manage to end Islam or the Prophet's authority in Medina as the Quraysh had hoped, although it did sow seeds of tension between Medina's Muslims and the Jews, most of whom had refused to honor the terms of the constitution and join the battle. It was becoming clear that neither the Muslims nor the Quraysh were going to be able to decisively defeat the other on the battlefield. Both sides thus resorted to trying to gain support among the numerous Arab tribes of the region, each hoping to tip the scales against the enemy. The Meccans in particular hoped to gain the support of Medina's Jewish tribes, which seemed willing to dislodge the Prophet from their midst. 5 years after the Prophet's hijrah, the Meccans besieged the city of Medina from the north, and sought the help of one of Medina's Jewish tribes, the Banu Qurayza, who lived on the southern outskirts of the city. It was a calculated gamble for the Jews. The siege looked promising, and by joining with the Quraysh, they could wipe out Muhammad and his followers for good. As it happened, however, the Meccans and their Jewish allies were unsuccessful. Muhammad, advised by a Persian immigrant named Salman, ordered the construction of a trench around the city to thwart the Meccan siege. The Battle of the Trench, as it was called, was a disastrous failure for the Quraysh, who failed to even dent the power of Muhammad in the city. But it was even worse for the Banu Qurayza. They had broken the terms of the constitution, and thus were liable to be punished according to its terms. An arbitrator assigned to the case ruled against the subversive tribe, ordering that the men who had taken part in the siege be executed while the women and children exiled from the city. Muhammad was setting an important standard with his handling of the Jews of Medina. He made clear that Islamic law had no problem with the presence of non-Muslims living within a Muslim state. For years Medina's Jews had been tolerated. But when they failed to live up to existing agreements and threatened the security of the Islamic State, punishment had to be doled out. Like everything he did, Muhammad's example in dealing with Banu Qurayza would set the precedent for hundreds of years of Muslim relations with non-Muslims. Victory. With his position in Medina secured, Muhammad could finally deal with Quraysh on an equal level. Confident in the stability of the Muslim state and inspired by a recent revelation that promised impending victory, Muhammad set out in 628 with an army of 1,500 towards Mecca. But this was not an army intent on war. They were clothed in the simple two-garment outfit of pilgrims, and only carried traveling swords. No armor, no cavalry, and no banners of war were brought along. Muhammad hoped to gain access to Mecca and the Kaaba peacefully in order to conduct a pilgrimage. He camped just outside the borders of Mecca, at Hudaybiyah, waiting for permission from Quraysh to enter the sacred grounds. The Meccans, no doubt baffled by the audacity of the Muslims, just 6 years after their escape from Mecca, had a difficult decision to make. If they allowed Muhammad and his followers to enter Mecca, they would look weak to other Arab tribes, unable to prevent a barely armed force from entering their city. On the other hand, their main role in Mecca was to facilitate the pilgrimage for anyone, a duty they took very seriously. In the end, they negotiated a treaty with Muhammad. They agreed to vacate Mecca for 3 days to allow Muhammad and the Muslims to complete the pilgrimage the following year. Muhammad would have to return to Medina that year without having visited his hometown. Furthermore, a truce was agreed to. Mecca and Medina, and their affiliated tribes, would refrain from fighting for 10 years. Some Muslims were clearly discontented by the terms of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, having hoped for immediate access to Mecca or even a complete conquest of Quraysh. But the treaty provided a welcomed respite from conflict that gave Muhammad the ability to expand Islam far beyond Medina. Now, without the threat of internal dissent and external invasion, he had the freedom to send missionaries throughout the Arabian Peninsula, and even beyond, into the Byzantine and Persian empires in the north. Bedouin tribes converted en masse, allying themselves with the Prophet. Even Meccans began to convert. Khalid ibn al-Walid and Amr ibn al-As, two of Quraysh's greatest military commanders, left Mecca and joined Muhammad in Medina in the years after Hudaybiyah. The treaty had failed to give the Muslims immediate control of their holiest site, but it allowed Islam to grow exponentially throughout Arabia, much to the dismay of the hardliners in Mecca, who just a few years earlier hoped to end Islam. Furthermore, the sanctity of the truce was not completely fulfilled. Just 2 years after its signing, a tribe allied with Quraysh launched a surprise attack against a tribe allied with Muhammad just outside the borders of Mecca. This constituted a breach of the treaty, which had promised a total peace for 10 years. With the treaty now voided, Muhammad could call upon his newfound allies throughout the peninsula in a new expedition aimed for Mecca. This time, however, they would not be traveling as peaceful pilgrims. Muhammad was finally in a position of power. Thousands of Muslims from all over the peninsula were now at his command, bound by alliances and conversions to join his army whenever called upon. At this point, the people of Mecca knew there was no way they could militarily defeat the Prophet. It was Mecca versus dozens of tribes, all united together for the first time in the history of the Arabs. Attempted negotiations between Muhammad and the Quraysh ended in failure, and in early 630, his army of over 10,000 Muslims brought together from all corners of Arabia marched on the holy city. Most Meccans realized that resistance was futile. With the exception of some minor skirmishes, Muhammad's army entered Mecca bloodlessly. His triumphant return to his birthplace was seen by his followers as the final victory of Islam over polytheism, of truth over falsehood. The hundreds of idols surrounding the Kaaba were destroyed, making the sanctuary a place for Muslim worship dedicated to one God. For many in Mecca, including the leader of the Quraysh, Abu Sufyan, this complete conquest was a sign that their idols were in fact no more than crude sculptures of stone and wood. They submitted to Muhammad, the man they had oppressed, chased out of the city, and gone to war with. Muhammad, in turn, proved to be a lenient conqueror. Most Meccans were left unharmed, a remarkable gesture for a people accustomed to brutal tribal wars that showed no mercy. Once again, Muhammad was setting the example that his prophethood marked the beginning of a new era with new rules and customs. The pre-Islamic period of Jahiliyah, meaning ignorance, would forever be left behind. Muhammad's return to Mecca is remarkable if only because of the circumstances of his life in the preceding years. Just 8 years after his escape in the middle of the night from his oppressors, Muhammad returned to his hometown as a victorious leader with an army of thousands. In Mecca, he had gone from a trusted merchant, to an undesirable rebel against polytheism, to a distant enemy, to the benevolent conqueror of his native land. No doubt his rapid accession to power and his ability to break down old tribal rivalries under the banner of unity in Islam were seen as miraculous and signs of his prophethood by many. The Muslims of that era, including those who had suffered through the early years of oppression in Mecca and the ones who only converted upon the city's conquest, thus believed there was something special about Islam. It was guided and protected by God, in their eyes, and they were on a special mission to spread this true religion to the rest of the world. This mindset would play a major role in the way Muslims viewed themselves on the world stage throughout their history. The end of the prophethood. By the time of the conquest of Mecca, Muhammad was about 60 years old, an old man by the standards of his time. Through his sayings and the continuing revelations of the Quran, the tenets of Islam had been formalized, covering everything from articles of belief, to instructions for worship, to guidelines for Islamic governance. A new social order had been inaugurated, one that left behind tribalism and nationalism in favor of Islamic unity under divine laws. Muhammad codified this in his last sermon, where he declared that you all descended from Adam and Adam was created from dirt. The most noble in the sight of God is the most pious. No Arab is superior to a non-Arab except by their God consciousness. His religious and social message was intertwined with a political one that forged a united Muslim empire that spanned the entire Arabian Peninsula, the first time in history that all the Arabs had been united. He even managed to make some inroads among the tribes living on the southern edges of the Byzantine and Persian empires, an accomplishment that would not go unnoticed by those two great empires, who would soon take the rapid spread of Islam very seriously. After his conquest of Mecca, Muhammad returned to his adopted hometown of Medina. He had, after all, promised to lead the Muslim Ummah from that oasis 8 years earlier when Aws and Hazraj invited him. Here, he began to make preparations for a Muslim community that would continue long after his death. He spoke increasingly about the obligations of a true believer, the preservation of the Quran and his example. In early 632, he journeyed to Mecca for a final pilgrimage, the Hajj. He spoke to thousands of his followers, all equally dressed in simple white robes regardless of their financial status, reminding them of the equality of all people. He cautioned his followers to avoid oppression, treat women with respect and love, and leave behind the old tribal rivalries that had been the bane of Arab civilization for centuries. His farewell sermon summarized his prophethood. It was a complete revolution in every sense. In the eyes of his followers, a new order was dawning upon the world, one that would be based upon God's law and inspired by the example of Muhammad. After the pilgrimage, Muhammad returned to Medina, where the foundation was laid for the continued expansion of Islam. Learned men were sent to distant provinces such as Yemen and the eastern edge of Arabia to teach the recently converted the basics of Islam. Medina, the community in closest contact with the Prophet, would operate as a hub of knowledge about Islam, serving to educate the rest of the Muslim world, even after the Prophet. A military expedition was prepared to trek north against the Byzantines. The Islamic ethics of war, which would guide hundreds of years of Muslim armies, were reiterated. According to Islamic belief, Muhammad's role was to serve as a messenger for God, delivering God's word, the Quran, and acting as a model for Muslims. After 23 years of acting as a prophet of God, his mission was complete. The Quran was finalized and recorded on scraps of parchment, leather, and bone, but more importantly memorized completely by many of Muhammad's companions. The pre-Islamic tradition of memorizing long poems gave the Arabs the ability to maintain and ensure the preservation of Islam's holy book. Narrations of Muhammad's actions and sayings were also given due importance, and spread throughout Arabia by word of mouth. According to Islamic tradition, one of the final verses of the Quran revealed to Muhammad stated, "Today I have perfected for you your religion and completed my favor upon you and have approved for you Islam as your religion." Quran 5:3. Muhammad fell ill in the early summer of 632. He experienced debilitating headaches and a fever, and was soon unable to walk without the help of his cousin Ali and his uncle Abbas. When he was unable to lead the 5 daily prayers in the mosque, he appointed his close friend and companion, Abu Bakr, to lead them in his place. He spent his final days in the house of his wife Aisha, the daughter of Abu Bakr. From a wall adjoining the home to the mosque, he was able to watch the Muslim community follow his instructions to worship God, even in his absence. It was no doubt an emotional time for his followers, who had been with him through the difficult days in Mecca, the fierce battles against Quraysh where he established his authority, and his triumphant bloodless conquest of Mecca. They had looked to Muhammad for guidance and leadership in all aspects of life. His increasing talk of death, and the fact that he was now unable to even rise up to lead them in prayer played heavily on the hearts of the Muslim community. His final days were spent resting in his home, with his head in the lap of his wife Aisha. Close family members and friends visited, hoping to see some signs of recovery in their leader. But one of the central aspects of Islam was uncompromising monotheism. Muhammad preached that only God is divine, all other creatures, whether they were animals, humans, or even angels would experience death, according to Islamic belief. Thus while they were prepared for his passing, recognizing that Islam would indeed continue after him, Muhammad's followers, deeply emotionally invested in this man that had led them out of the era of pre-Islamic polytheism and tribal warfare, could not imagine life without him. On June 8, 632, with his head on Aisha's lap and his followers gathered in the mosque hoping to hear of his recovery, the first era of Islamic history, spanning the 23 years of prophethood, ended as the Prophet Muhammad breathed his last.